Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes, so if you could bear with us, we're going to wait for a few more participants to join, and then we'll get going. So it looks like we have a critical mass now. So we're going to kick off into today's event. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Herbert. I'm a senior expert here at the North Africa and Sahel Observatory for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Leveraging Flows, the surge in irregular migration from Tunisia to Europe. Now, this is an event that's launching two different reports, one by Hamza Medeb and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the second by Tasnim Abdulrahim and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. What we're going to do today and why we're here is start to unpack a situation that's ongoing now, which is the sharp rise in irregular migration from Tunisia to Europe. Now, over the last 3 years, we've seen an accelerating situation where thousands of Tunisians and as well foreigners have gotten in boats, on planes, and attempted to enter Europe via irregular means. Now, largely this emanates from Tunisia's economic challenges, social challenges, and also political challenges. And it's one of those things that has increasingly drawn the attention of international actors such as the European Union and member states, which look with keen concern at what this surge in irregular migration portends, and also are looking for solutions as to how to address it. Now, I'm very happy to say that we have in this event some of the top experts to answer these questions. And I'll go through them in the order that they're going to be presenting. So first is Hamza Medeb, and Hamza is a research fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he co-leads the political economy program. Now, he is also part of the Cross-Border Conflict Project, which is a joint project between the Carnegie Middle East Center, the Asia Foundation, and the Rift Valley Institute. His research focuses on the political economy of Tunisia and North Africa, the politics of illicit transnational flows, governance and corruption, as well as the developmental security nexus, which I think is quite key on this particular issue. Tasnim is an analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, where she primarily researches human smuggling dynamics in Tunisia and Morocco. Before joining the Global Initiative, Tasnim worked as a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a junior policy officer with the European Center for Development Policy Management. Now that brings me to Anna Knoll. And Anna Knoll is also with the European Center for Development Policy Management and is the head of their migration and mobility team. Her current research focuses on the interaction between migration, displacement, and development processes, the external and developmental dimensions of the European Union's migration and asylum policies, migration in European development policies, as well as African narratives, policies, and processes on migration. Prior to joining ECDPM, Anna worked as a German fellow at the UN World Food Programme, as an intern at the European Commission. And she holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy and economics from the University of Beirut and a master's degree in international political economy from the London School of Economics. I would be remiss if I didn't say that she's also currently pursuing a very interesting part-time PhD at the Maastricht School of Governance. Now, in terms of the structure for today's event, what we're going to do is start with presentations from the three speakers. At the end of that presentation period, it's going to go from Hamza to Tasneem to Anna. We'll go into a question and answer session that starts to address some of the deeper questions you may have around the phenomenon of Tunisian irregular migration, migration of foreigners through Tunisia, and policy responses by European actors. What I'd ask is that you type any questions that you have into the question and answer dialogue button, which is at the bottom of your screen. And I will read those off to the speakers as we go. That way, we'll try to cram in as much information, as many questions as we possibly can to really get the rich insights that they're able to offer us. All that said, Hamza, the floor is yours to get into the meat of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, and I'm really happy to be part of this panel. Actually, it's really an honor to join you, Tasneem and Anna, for a joint panel between the Global Initiative and Carnegie, and to talk about a very important topic currently, I mean, in Tunisia and for the Mediterranean as well, which is the surge of irregular migration from Tunisia to Europe. Well, I mean, to make quick comments about or remarks about the current situation, which I'm sure Tasneem and Anna will elaborate. I mean, on different aspects of this new trends and accelerated trends of migration between Tunisia and Europe. I think there are three important comments or remarks to do. The first one is that I mean, in 2021, but mainly in 2022, and increasingly in 2023, we saw an increasing number of irregular and illegal migration from Tunisia to Europe. I mean, if we compare really numbers, I think in 2022 the number exceeds 30,000 arrival to Italy. This is extremely important to point out because simply this exceeds the last record, which was the one reached in 2011, right after the fall of Ben Ali regime, where 27,000 Tunisians were arrived to Italy at that time. So this is an important, I mean, aspect to notice, and it's closely related, in my sense, to the slow or the deterioration, of the economic and social conditions in Tunisia. Actually, the country has been going through a deep economic crisis, has never actually recovered from the pandemic, and has been strongly hit by the repercussions of the war in Ukraine in terms of the surge in food and energy prices. But also, I mean, concretely, actually, these crises or these shocks have exacerbated long-standing, actually, economic weaknesses and economic deficiencies, pushing up, I mean, the number of unemployed people, poverty rates, etc. So I think that this is extremely important to keep in mind. One of the key factors that can explain this surge, not only, I'm not really reducing or this to the economic factors, but I mean, it's clear that the deterioration of the economic and social situation has played an important role in the surge of migration, actually. The second key aspect, actually, is the fact that there was a diversification of routes that has been taken by the I mean, migrants. Most of them, they took the Mediterranean route, as you know, but also we saw a surge of, especially in 22, the affirmation of an alternative route that is going through or connecting Tunisia through to Western Europe through Turkey and Western Balkans. And this is extremely important, that it shows an important aspect here is the fact that the capacity of migrants, but also networks to settle and to establish new alternative routes, but also the sort of destabilization and the temptation among many states, either in North Africa or in Western Balkans, in a way to play this migration card through to put pressure on the European Union, which was, I mean, basically the case of Serbia, given too many reasons. We can discuss them later in our discussion. But these networks, they benefited clearly from the ambivalent position of Serbia vis-a-vis the EU, and we saw really clearly a surge on reactivation of these Western Balkan routes, but through which many thousands of Tunisians, I think more than 6,000 of Tunisians, took this route in 2022 before it got closed, of course, because of when Serbia and the EU put an end to the free visa regime, actually, to Tunisians. The third aspect, which is an extremely important aspect I want to highlight, is the fact that migration has become, has evolved or has become in a way a sort of highly contentious political issue. It used to be perceived as an economic, as social, as sometimes as connected, of course, to criminal networks, etc. But in 2023, we saw a high politicization of migration, actually, for many reasons, of course. The first one is that the attitude of Tunisian authorities, and here we can point out to the remarks of the president in February of this year, in 23, when he denounced sort of the great replacement or the threat to Tunisia's demography coming from the migration of sub-Saharan people in Tunisia, actually. And this actually triggered, in a way, a series of tension within the country, pushing, of course, I mean, foreign migrants in Tunisia, especially sub-Saharan, of course, Africans, to really leave the country and to go to Europe. So the trend that we have been seeing since the beginning of the year is this acceleration of this trend. The other aspect, which is related actually to the politicization of migration, the evolution of migration to a sort of highly contentious political issue, is the attitude of the European Union and especially of Italy, of many European governments toward Tunisia when it comes to the issue of migration. We saw sort of, I mean, the migration issue has become a pillar or an important issue that is on the agenda of the relations between Tunisia and the EU. A visit of two prime ministers, European ministers coming to, prime ministers coming to Tunisia with the president of the European Commission. An EU package deal was designed and offered to stem, in a way, the flows of migration coming migration flows from Tunisia. So we see clearly that the concerns, I think Anna will elaborate on this, but the highly concerns in Europe vis-a-vis the issue of migration, and how it has become not only a sort of an economic issue, but also highly an issue related to security, to politics, and even to geopolitics. I'll stop here and, of course, happy to pursue the discussion later.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hamza. Tasneem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Hamza, and hello, everyone. So thanks, Hamza, for setting the scene and outlining the major trends related to migration that we've seen evolving over the past few years. So I'll try to delve a bit into the rise of irregular migration from Tunisia and expand a bit on who is moving from and through the country and the main methods of mobility. So I'll jump right in. So as Matt said in the introduction, over the past 3.5 years, we have seen a growing wave of migration from Tunisia towards Europe. Last year, in particular, there was a sharp rise in migration from Tunisia, which has reached a new record, as Hamza mentioned. So in 2022, a total of 32,371 irregular migrants arrived in Italy from Tunisia, which is up from, which is a major increase from the previous record registered in 2011 at the wake of the revolution. In addition to these departures from Tunisia, there was a record number of Tunisian arrivals through the Western Balkan route, with around 6,782 Tunisian irregular migrants arriving in Europe through this route. A similar dynamic has been observed on the Tunisian side. So during last year, Tunisian security and defense forces intercepted 38,713 irregular migrants at sea and in the country's coastal areas. This figure represents actually a notable increase in comparison to 2021, when 23,328 interceptions were recorded. As you all know, the surge has continued into this year. The first 6 months of 2023 so far saw a substantial acceleration in human smuggling and migration dynamics. So by 26 June, over 30,000 migrants arrived in Italy from Tunisia, and the Tunisian authorities intercepted over 26,000 migrants till the present. So overall, foreign migrants living in Tunisia have driven the surge. To date this year, they account for roughly 85% of arrivals to Italy. However, there was also a significant increase in Tunisian arrivals in Italy. So, for example, between 1 January and 30 May, 7,353 Tunisian irregular migrants arrived in Italy, which is a substantial increase from 4,316 during the same period last year. So these figures obviously denote a substantial rise in the number of migrants leaving from the country. In late 2022, Tunisia has replaced Libya as the first country of embarkation towards Italy. Now, this does not mean displacement of departures from Libya towards Tunisia. There is very little evidence of migrants moving in significant numbers from Libya towards Tunisia, but basically the dynamics has been changing in Tunisia. The number of sub-Saharan migrants living in the country has been expanding over the past 10 years, although we do not have reliable statistics on the numbers of these undocumented migrants, but their visibility has been increasing in certain parts of the country, such as in the capital city, Tunis, and in Sfax. So this brings us to the question of who is moving from Tunisia. Now, during 2022, we saw that the profile of those embarking from Tunisia continued to expand. Basically, traditionally, embarkations from Tunisia have overwhelmingly involved Tunisian nationals, mostly young men, and this was not a new trend. I mean, this trend goes back to the 1990s, with very few foreigners using Tunisia as a launching point. However, this pattern has changed substantially last year, with foreign migrants accounting for 71% of all interceptions by Tunisian security forces. Now, this represents a major change from 2021, when foreign migrants represented only 31% of interceptions. So here we've got a development that breaks with long-standing dynamics in which Tunisians accounted for most interceptions by Tunisian security forces. Also, arrivals in Italy reflected a similar increase in foreign arrivals. According to NHCR data, sea arrivals in Italy indicate that migrants originating primarily from Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea were the main groups of foreigners embarking from Tunisia. However, it is clear that there is a broader set of nationalities that is moving from the country. So if anything, this growing share of foreign migrants leaving from Tunisia underscores the country's mounting importance as a destination and transit country. Now, one final point on who is embarking from Tunisia. In terms of departures by Tunisian nationals themselves, historically, young Tunisian men have accounted for the majority of Tunisian arrivals in Italy. That continues to be the case today. However, in recent years, we have seen a steady increase in the number of women, minors, and entire families arriving in Italy. So I'll move to the question of methods of mobility. So there are two key methods for irregular departures from Tunisia. Mainly, the main method involves a reliance on smuggling networks. So most smuggling networks in Tunisia continue to be small and are active all along the Tunisian coastline. We see that there is a difference between networks serving Tunisian and foreign migrants. So basically, networks working with Tunisians are operating all along the Tunisian coastline, while those catering to foreign migrants tend to be concentrated in Sfax, Mahdia, and to a lesser extent in Zarzis in southern Tunisia. However, networks working with Tunisian migrants or providing services to Tunisian migrants are active all along the Tunisian coastline. One major change that we have seen last year in terms of the composition of smuggling networks is that sub-Saharans are becoming increasingly involved in these smuggling networks, working both as smugglers and as middlemen. The other key method of mobility from Tunisia is self-smuggling. Basically, this method involves a group of migrants coming together, pooling their resources, purchasing a boat and all other equipment needed for the crossing, and embarking autonomously. Now, beginning last year, we have seen a major shift in this form of mobility. In that, previously, it was restricted to Tunisian nationals, mostly from coastal areas who have good knowledge of the sea, who are equipped with nautical experience that allows them to navigate the sea and arrive safely. That continues to be the case, but we have seen since last year that sub-Saharans are increasingly relying on this form of mobility. And the Tunisian authorities arrested migrants in the process of building their own boats in several instances. So this reliance on self-smuggling should be seen as an attempt by migrants to ensure the success of the journey. I mean, one key factor that influences the choice of this method is negative perception of smugglers who are seen as abusive, demanding exorbitant prices, possibly cheating migrants, offering boats in poor quality, contrary to what was promised to migrants. So basically, self-smuggling is an attempt to avoid those risks and increase the chances of the success of the journey. Also, for sub-Saharans in particular, this shift towards self-smuggling has occurred by an increasing number of shipwrecks last year that have left a high number of casualties of dead and missing migrants among sub-Saharans. I should also say that the rise in smuggling and self-smuggling in Tunisia has ignited the growth of an illicit business around boats in Tunisia, and it's actually the ease of procuring boats which has also contributed to the proliferation and the diversification of smuggling methods. I mean, smugglers and migrants can procure boats in different ways, including through boat agents operating in coastal areas, or through workshops fabricating or making these boats. So in addition to maritime routes, last year there was a notable development, which is the growing popularity of the Western Balkan route among Tunisians, as we mentioned earlier. So this itinerary is not entirely new. However, its importance had been limited. However, since late 2021, there was a major surge in Tunisian movement along this route. So we saw that there was basically in 2022, there was 6,782 Tunisians were apprehended on the route. As we saw with maritime migration on the Balkan route, most Tunisian migrants were young men. However, towards the end of 2022, there was a growing number of families and women and their children using this route. However, this route was basically closed late last year as Serbia moved to impose visas on Tunisians traveling to Serbia. So, I mean, this rapidly evolving context in Tunisia and the growing departures from the country spurred concerns in Europe and triggered enhanced talks between Tunisia and the EU on enhancing cooperation on migration and curbing migratory flows. So I'll leave it to Anna to speak on the perception on the EU side. I realize there's a lot I haven't touched on, but happy to expand on any points in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tasneem. And I should say that as you're listening to the various speakers, please do type in any questions you have into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll field those to the speakers after we conclude with the presentations. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you very much to the Global Initiative and Carnegie for inviting me to this very interesting panel together with Tasneem and Hamza. I will talk a bit about the EU side and the perceptions on what's happening. So in the EU, it's not a surprise the topic of migration is still a top priority, and it's a very emotional topic. So the migration developments pointed out by Tasneem just now in Tunisia and towards the EU have been viewed with a lot of concern. If you look at the most recent poll by the Eurobarometer, migration is voted as one of the third, well, I think it's the third most important issue facing the EU as a bloc. Rows over migration can bring down governments, as we've seen again now with the Dutch Prime Minister handing in his resignation. And then this all takes place against the background of, on the one hand, increasing evidence of illegal pushbacks and rights violations by EU actors itself, and on the other hand, a situation where still we sadly witness boat tragedies and deaths at sea. So this emotional discussion makes it difficult at times to find good answers. Then the context also of the Ukraine situation has shaken up some things. Capacity and focus on migration shifted temporarily towards housing and integrating Ukrainians, but with the implication that the political necessity for EU member states to reduce other forms of irregular migration through the Mediterranean, through other routes, has just increased even more, as it was already an issue before. So for political survival, it's one of the key areas for the EU and the member states to look at, and they need to deliver. And delivering means delivering on a reduction of arrivals in most EU member states, tackled through achieving cooperation on reducing irregular departures, increasing return figures, for nationals of origin countries, but also for third country nationals. So that's the background. The EU, though, therefore increasingly views relationships through the prism of migration. A telling example is the quote of Italian's leader Meloni, who lobbied very strongly for a while to release financial aid to Tunisia at EU level, with saying Tunisia is a priority because destabilization in Tunisia would have a serious repercussion on one, stability of all Northern Africa. And those repercussions inevitably arrive here, meaning it's all about migration, and the geopolitics of it play a strong role in how the EU responds. There is a trend in the EU to broker increasingly formal and informal deals, not always very transparent. There is an increasing necessity to rely on these transactional partnerships to reduce irregular migration, sometimes at the cost of broader rights agendas or values agenda of the EU. And I think this is one of the uncomfortable truths of the EU external dimension of migration. The EU member states have very recently agreed on the new pact on migration, which still has to go through European Parliament and several instances. And it relies very strongly on the external dimension. All the internal solidarity mechanisms in there actually work only if member states can send people or return people without the prospect of getting asylum request approved back to partner countries. So the EU needs collaborators like Tunisia, and Tunisia has been for a while actually a priority country in that respect. So for that, it uses positive and negative conditionalities, incentives, and this brings some opportunities, but also poses quite a number of difficulties and trade-offs. And this is not different in the case of Tunisia. As I said, one of the priority countries for some time when it comes to this external dimension of the EU's migration policies. Again, sort of with coming to Tunisia specifically, the EU has supported the democratic transition in Tunisia for the last decade, and now migration concerns, and that includes also stability and security, dominate to a large extent how it views that relationship. Sort of the witnessing of maybe less democratic tendencies within the country, the EU is a bit finds it difficult to balance, and it's not taking a really firm position or introduces any consequences against what some perceive as the deterioration of the rule of law. So two reasons for this. One, because stability first. There is sort of a view that it's need to support the collapse and the economic chaos that Hamza has also described. And then the issue of migration, so geography matters, and the need to decrease irregular flows, which is tied to this first point. So the message also is, though, EU interests first. So I think those civil society actors and many forces that have supported this democratic transition have criticized this approach very strongly, and also realized that the EU's value agenda is maybe more hollow when other EU interests, meaning in this case very strongly migration, are at stake. So the outcome of this, as Hamza has mentioned, is the quite historic deal offering, I think, more than 1 billion to help Tunisia overcome this deepening economic crisis. Possibly also the source of why so many migrants cross. But also it includes further assistance on specifically border management in a bid to break this cyclical business model of smugglers and traffickers. So this package is actually nearly triple what the bloc has so far provided in migration funding, so the additional 105 million in grants only for migration management. This type of transactional cooperation, one could say, is modeled on this cash for migrant control pact with Turkey, but it also builds on existing cooperation that the EU had with Tunisia on joint management of migration and border control between 2016 and 2020, for example. More than 37 million euros from the EU Trust Fund of Africa were granted to Tunisia. So it's not necessarily new, but it's the next level and stepping up. Another point is that EU member states are also not necessarily in the partnerships, but that's where it becomes a bit more blurry and not very transparent. I think there's a less clear line of defining clear red lines with regards to essential clauses on democracy, on rights, on rule of law within that partnership. This may also sort of take place in an geographical reality where other external partners seek to take Europe's place, so concerned to overall protect its interests and maybe less willing to really or able to push for a values agenda, and may not even see that as helpful in this sense. So I think also no one necessarily would deny that partnerships or agreements to manage migration or cooperate would be part of the puzzle piece. But I think the approach raises a lot of questions and dilemmas for the EU. One could rightly point out that may be an unfortunate time or moment to step up the cooperation to this extent. And a key question for the EU is what implications of this cooperation is in the long term. It is a more transactional partnership. What is the implication for Tunisian citizens and for the rights of migrants? We've all heard the news about the current controversies and the treatment. Is the EU actively contributing to factors pushing more to migrate in the longer term, or is it helping to reduce it with the economic support? And an even harder question, what would be alternatives and what risks would other approaches entail as well? Maybe just to mention also that in the EU, there are also several layers and different interests, and there's turfs and silos, different views on how to approach the challenge we witness. And coordinating all involved ministries, services, and maybe also regions of 27 EU member states is definitely a big challenge for the EU. So it's also not black and white. And there's also different approaches happening at the same time. So maybe also good to think that different EU member states view Tunisia in different lights when it comes to migration, some more as an origin country, also for the EU's declining workforce, and looking at legal pathways, looking at my own country, Germany is, I think, very interested. Some more Tunisia as a transit country with this whole idea of reducing, but possibly sending those back that cannot find asylum in the EU. And Tunisia as destination countries, that was always also part of, actually, I mean, it is a destination country itself, and the question of protection comes up. So what is to come? I'm not sure about the prospect of substantially improving the coherence of EU responses to Tunisia in the current political context. I think it always remains a balancing act, sort of for the EU to reconcile values and interests. But yeah, we'll have to see and watch very carefully, I think, what consequences of that approach means for Tunisia and the region. Broadly, the common denominator and agreement in the EU is still to go down the route of more of the same type of partnerships. I think in a letter that was leaked to the press of EU Commission President von der Leyen, she apparently writes that our aim as EU should be for our current initiative with Tunisia to act as a blueprint for similar partnerships in the future, and that the Commission would seek new comprehensive partnerships with third countries of the same kind. I mean, it's a continuation of, the Turkey deal, very, unique situation, but similar elements, and it's sort of this approach and then tailored to each individual country. I think that's what we'll see. In terms of rights of migrants, I don't think the situation will improve, if not worsen, not just as part of some of the other elements that we see in the pact on the rights within the EU and detention possibilities, but also sort of the broader partnerships and the governments the EU is willing to support. I don't think necessarily that the priority is the rights or safeguarding the rights of migrants, even though obviously that's still a very strong concern of the EU, and it appears, the risky thing is just more that even if the EU and member states are very serious about ensuring rights compliance of these deals, which, rightly maybe one can doubt, given that EU member states act as themselves are involved in pushbacks, but the existing agreements that also are not, there's no tools for the EU to really enforce or monitor in partner countries the approaches taken. So I think this is a continuous area where NGOs and human rights actors need to do a lot of work to hold accountable and watch, basically. I'll leave it at that, and I hope we can have a good Q&A and good discussion.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, Hamza. Thank you very much, Tasneem. I think this has been a really deep dive into some very complex issues. It's very clear that we're seeing an ecosystem that is in flux and being shaped right now, both by the actions coming from below, the actions being played by migrants, but also by human smugglers and others, as well as actions coming from above, including both the pressures and policy programs as chosen by the European Union and the agency and actions by the government of Tunisia. Now, I'll start the question and answer here. And drawing on some of the points that have been raised in the question and answer box so far, I'd like to pose questions to Hamza, to Tasneem, and to Anna. I'll take the floor's prerogative on this. Hamza, one of the issues that we've heard kind of a couple times in the debate around, especially rising foreign irregular migration through Tunisia, is the question of why Tunisia can't simply do what Serbia did, why it can't revoke, the visa waivers that allow for arrival of large numbers of migrants. Obviously, there are geopolitical issues here. Could you unpack for our audience what the geopolitical issues are that Tunisia faces with sub-Saharan African countries and its broader geopolitical interests in especially West Africa? Because I think that this is a point that I haven't heard explored as much in this the debate around irregular migration and Tunisia.
Sure. This is an important point and an important question. Absolutely, Matt. I mean, I think one of the options, as was rightly pointed out by one of our attendees in the comments, is I think one maybe also the EU or some European countries are pushing towards a sort of putting an end to this visa-free regime vis-a-vis the Ivorian nationals, for example. It's not my sense. It won't be easy to implement, at least for a couple of reasons. The first one is there are many Tunisian companies operating in Ivory Coast, actually. There are many companies operating in the construction, and there are economic ties. And the Ivory Coast is one of the Western African countries with one of the most important Tunisian nationals settled there. Working for either Tunisian companies or French companies actually operating in the country. But also, this is it's an important market for Tunisian businesses and companies. It's also actually many students from Ivory Coast. They used to attend universities here in Tunis. So the resistance against this, putting an end to the visa-free regime comes not only from the government, but partly from the business elites, actually. And this is extremely important to keep in mind. Losing a trade partner like Ivory Coast will be costly in a way, economically for Tunisia. The second aspect is that it's clear that, Tunisia, in the situation where it is now in terms of economically, socially, and financially, basically, one of the bargaining chips is the migration in a way. It's clear that the whole issue of migration has gave a sort of political leverage in a way to Saïd regime in its negotiations with the EU. It doesn't mean that there is a weaponization of migration from Tunisia. I don't buy this argument. I think that weaponization should be really clearly assumed. When we look to Morocco, several times, and countries, not only Morocco but other countries who weaponize migration, they openly assume this. But my sense is that there is a sort of trying an attempt to build a leverage, I think, vis-a-vis the EU. And geopolitically, migration is one of the few really cards that is there in a way. Either the migration of Tunisian nationals or of sub-Saharan nationals, actually. So this is I think that's why if we connect this with the announcement of the president, or the remarks of the president, when he pointed out to the fact that there is a threat on Tunisia's demography, etc. It seems like, this has really triggered high concerns in Europe, actually, because they knew in a way that the consequence will be really an acceleration of departure, of migration of sub-Saharan nationals, actually, who used to live in Tunisia, who many of them were also actually really, involved in the economic activity of the country, filling gaps in many sectors, and restoration and construction sectors, etc. So playing an important role in Tunisia's economy, by the way. But I think the tensions that followed the announcement of the president, the security escalation that followed the announcement of the president, pushed many of them actually either to return back to their home countries, or to cross the Mediterranean. And I think this has clearly created a sense of urgency within the EU. And this explains this EU package, actually, that has been really brought and offered by the EU. It was meant not only, on my really understanding, is that this package is, of course, mainly driven by migration, but was designed really to stabilize Tunisia. It's clear that there is high concern in the EU and among EU member states, especially among Italy, within Italy and within Italian authorities, that the high risk will be sort of destabilization and economic collapse of Tunisia. Let's remember that Tunisia is on the brink of defaulting on its debt, actually. Really, an economic collapse is not really a very unlikely scenario. Tunisia is really struggling, actually, to repay its debt, and without an IMF deal, this will be highly unlikely, actually, in the coming months. And my sense is that really, the quote, and I totally agree, and I really like the point made by Anna. The situation is not black or white, actually. Even in Tunisia, we see clearly a diversity of interest within the government, and sort of between the government and the president. And my sense is within even, decision makers in Tunisia, on how to deal, actually, either with the EU or with the management, in a way, of flows of the presence of sub-Saharan nationals in Tunisia, accepting or not this EU deal. We don't know exactly what this implies, because there is a lack of transparency, and even, the negotiations aspect that would have helped to clarify concretely the different aspects of this deal are not really known. So my sense, to keep my answer actually short, and I'll stop here, is that really there is a diversity of interest, and in this situation, Tunisia wasn't able, and the decision-making process in Tunisia wasn't really able to impose or to put an end to the visa-free regime for sub-Saharan nationals on one side, because it will hurt many important interests in the country. But at the same time, actually, it hasn't been able to negotiate really this stabilization deal or this package deal in a way that allows, or that would give a sort of margin for maneuver to the country, or in a way or another, and to help at least, preserve the dignity of sub-Saharan nationals who are living in Tunisia. So this is, and so far, the end result of this indecision, actually, or the incapacity to decide, is a statu quo. But at the same time, the statu quo is over days creating a sort of deterioration of the situation of, the economic situation of Tunisia, the situation of, and the security situation of sub-Saharan nationals. And actually, really, the threats are not behind us, but they are still actually on the table. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Hamza. And I think that these are some very important points to bring up around the deterioration of the situation. One of the things that I hear a lot too is the comparison to Libya and the situation as has evolved in Libya. Tasneem, I was wondering if you could get into that issue and kind of explain to us how it is that human smuggling from Tunisia is similar to or different from what we see in Libya. You know, what are the commonalities? What are the differences? And especially if you could kind of steer your answer also at a gender lens. You know, one of the things that's come out of the Libyan context vis-a-vis irregular migration over the course of the last 10 years has been a clear vulnerability of girls and women to sexual abuse by smugglers and by other actors within the Libyan context. Is that something that also is of concern within Tunisia, or is it a completely different circumstance? And if so, why?
Yes, thanks, Matt. So in terms of the smuggling networks in Tunisia, I think we can say broadly that they're substantially different from what we see in Libya. I mean, general smuggling networks in Tunisia tend to be small, often involving a handful of personnel, usually between 4 and 10 people, and they are highly distributed across the Tunisian coastline. So unlike in Libya, we do not see major organized groups that control territory and that can be in competition. In Tunisia also, I mean, the fact that they are highly distributed presents challenges to law enforcement. Basically, we've seen that in the narrative of the Tunisian government, they lay special emphasis on dismantling organized groups. We hear that often in the rhetoric of the president. And if you look at the data by the Tunisian MOI, there is a year-on-year increase in the number of arrests of smugglers and middlemen. However, the fact that smuggling groups are highly distributed and the nature of the smuggling business in Tunisia presents challenges to law enforcement. Smuggling groups can be pretty resilient. So basically, if a smuggling group is dismantled, another can emerge. There are little barriers to entering this business, and especially, I mean, for people who have very good knowledge of the sea and of embarkation zones, and probably the ease of entering the business is one of the reasons why we have seen a growing involvement of sub-Saharans in this lucrative business. In terms of risks to from gender perspective, the situation substantially differs in Tunisia in comparison to Libya. Obviously, migrants, and especially sub-Saharan migrants in Tunisia, they face challenges broadly and difficulties in terms of attacks and racism and discrimination. And we have seen how the situation has deteriorated sharply in Tunisia. And since the beginning of this year, we have registered an unprecedented spike in violence targeting undocumented migrants. But speaking in general, in terms of the contact between migrants and smugglers, there weren't major reports of women facing sexual exploitation by smugglers in Tunisia. There are other risks that people, that women and men face, I mean, including the risk of being cheated by migrants, having their money stolen, being pushed to embark on overcrowded boats, and enduring the risk of shipwrecks. But as far as I know, we haven't spotted significant reports of women facing sexual exploitation by smugglers in Tunisia. This is not to say that this doesn't happen. It can happen, but it's not as widespread as what we see in Libya.
Thank you, Tasneem. Anna, I'd like to turn to some points that you've made around stability and migration. You know, obviously, the discussions that we've heard coming out of Europe have focused on both issues. You know, on the need for ensuring stability in Tunisia, and also the need for addressing issues of migration. And it seems that there's a very clear understanding of the connection between instability and rising irregular migration, likely drawing from the 2011 events and the spike in migration in those years. But I'm curious on your thoughts as to whether the reverse is true, whether there's, in your view, an understanding of the potential destabilizing effects of heightened enforcement of irregular migration. So to put more bluntly, the sort of ramifications that we've seen in SFACs over the course of the last week and a half, and likely will continue to see. A second question to pose to you right now, because I think this is linked, is what time frame do you think the European Union and member states are thinking in right now when it comes to issues around Tunisia, and especially issues around migration? And what time frame do they need to be thinking in? Would this change their strategy? And essentially, what should their vision be?
Thank you, Matt. These are not easy questions, but I'll try my best. On the questions of how is it seen in Europe, and whether sort of what could be ramifications of this approach, I think it's discussed a bit under the radar. So I don't think that policymakers are completely oblivious about this, but politically it doesn't rise up to influencing much of the decisions, I would say. I think the decisions are still taken, as you say. It is about stability, with a strong prism of, viewed with a strong prism through of migration. Because the idea is, yes, if you have an unstable Tunisia, you have an unstable region, you have way more chaotic situations, and that has ramifications for irregular migration. And as I said before, one of the biggest objectives is to reduce irregular flows. So I think it's not completely absent, and there are surely deliberations on the risks of this approach as well, but it doesn't, it doesn't really sort of rise up to influence much. And then the time frame, I think that's a linked question, because the time frame is, let's say, short to mid, I would say, when it comes to the idea of getting from partners like Tunisia what the EU wants in terms of migration. So the stronger control plus return, even though I think Tunisia as a partner was, one of those that actually were more cooperative with the EU. Morocco and other countries more difficult. I think the question is more, and that is also, partly discussed, is what's the balance to take with a longer time frame on this sort of values agenda or governance agenda, or let's say, supporting the democracy. Because if we think that the underlying reasons for migrants is not only economic, but also political, then obviously that becomes a longer term question. And I do sometimes think, even though the situation, as Tasneem said, is very different in Libya, but essentially the EU was also faced with the same question a bit in Libya, and it put very strong focus on deals with the Libyan authorities, both in the past and still in the present, on the migration control element. And you do wonder whether some of these other questions, take a backseat. Again, I think the EU is a multi-layered animal, and it works on several fronts. I'm not saying it's completely absent, but definitely not sort of the priority. And then, it does create the question whether that is beneficial in the longer term. And I think that's a valid question to ask. For now, I see the political imperative for many EU member states and their governments to really resolve that migration issue. And that takes precedence. And that's why I said, I don't think it's necessarily, the deal is not necessarily only migration first. It is about economy, but it's always viewed in this prism of, okay, if we don't do this, there'll be even more migration. That's sort of what Meloni in her comment basically says.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to what's going on now around the deportation issue, the movement of migrants, especially from SFACs out towards Tunisia's borders, both with Libya and with Algeria. To Hamza, could you touch on what you see driving this from a political and governance side, and also whether instances such as these deportations are likely to become increasingly common with Tunisia. Essentially, this is something we're seeing across the entirety of the region, with Libya doing it, with Algeria doing it. Is this also likely to become an increasingly common tool for the government of Tunisia? And if not, why? To Tasneem, I was wondering if you could touch on the Algeria angle specifically. Why it is that there's been some focus on the Algerian border, what's the connection between irregular migration and Algeria, and how do you foresee the circumstances developing along the Tunisia-Algeria border when it comes both to migrants that have been bused to places such as Gafsa, Gasrin, but also the movement of new migrants across the frontier? Finally, to Anna, could you touch on where the opportunities for influence on the part of the European Union and member states are around Tunisia's domestic treatment of migrants? What are the avenues for engagement, and what are the strategic opportunities for the EU to engage in ways that both uphold its values as well as meet its broader strategic ambitions around the migration portfolio and Tunisia? So I'll turn it over to Hamza to start first, and then we can go through the three of you. Thank you.
I was muted actually. Yeah, thank you, Matt. I think personally that what is really, what is happening now with, especially with what we are seeing and witnessing in terms of deportation of sub-Saharan migrants and nationals to the border zones and border areas in Libya reflects two things, actually. It reflects the combination of a sort of really xenophobic populism, because this is clearly, this is one of the results of the populism that has been really, that triggered these extreme tensions and security escalation in a way within Tunisian society. Since these remarks or this denouncement of the president of this demographic threat, it seems like he triggered the sort of really an internal conflict within Tunisian society actually. And of course, in a situation of extremely poor economic situation, the deteriorated social situation, etc., there has been a sort of really an escalation of tensions and of xenophobic reactions vis-a-vis the sub-Saharan nationals. So, and even though the president tried actually to backpedal or to try to to retract in a way, to calm down and to his announcement, etc. But it was too late, really too little and too late in a sense. But this situation reflects another aspect and fundamental aspect, which is the weak capacities of Tunisia, the Tunisian state, actually. I think that both the security services, but broadly the state agencies, are really lacking capacities to anticipate actually crisis, whether climate crisis, migration crisis, any type of crisis. Really, they have been able, or they have been so far in the capacity to react, and to react in an uncoordinated way, actually. And I think this reflects really, the deterioration of the state capacities, this fragility, the deep fragility of Tunisia's state, which is a source of concern for Tunisians and primarily, but also for Tunisian partners as well, actually. So the end result, in a way, was that Tunisia was unable to really find a solution, to anticipate, to decide clearly and openly on the issue of on migration, and how to deal and how to manage actually the migration flows, either through negotiation, the negotiation with the EU, or through a negotiation with the sub-Saharan African countries, or a negotiation with Algeria and Libya as two neighboring countries, actually. My sense is that this really messy situation while dealing with the migration issue, it reflects also sort of geopolitical marginalization of Tunisia. That's clear. I wrote on this. I mean, from the debt perspective, from this incapacity of Tunisia really to build or to rely or to make deals on financial support or financial assistance. The fact that the country has got, I mean, isolated really, I mean, he's losing its, traditional partners, but it's getting also extremely marginal and geopolitically marginal vis-a-vis Algeria, for example. And I think without maybe overestimating the flows of migrants coming from Algeria or crossing the Tunisian-Algerian border, but it's clear that, I mean, Algeria is pushing back, I mean, migrants to Niger or to Tunisia in a way. So, but Tunisia tried actually to find a solution by deporting, a solution, I mean, between brackets, I mean, by deporting the migrants, sub-Saharan nationals to the Tunisian-Libyan border, which is a closed border almost now. So we see that there is really, I mean, a situation where Tunisia is unable to coordinate with its neighbors. It's really trying, but it has really weak and extremely weak leverage actually with both its neighbors actually. And I mean, in a situation where really strategically, the state agencies are not really able to anticipate actually, to really have in a way a proactive approach to crisis. Really, this is quite, I mean, the overlap of xenophobic populism with really lack capacities of the state agency, with a sort of geopolitical marginalization. We ended up actually into a humanitarian in a way, really, I mean, very, I mean, disastrous situation for sub-Saharan nationals and migrants here in Tunisia, but also for really, I mean, a situation where even Tunisians are also, I mean, they keep suffering from this situation, and where almost the struggle and the conflict is and tensions are building up and increasing actually between on the bottom of the society, I would say.
Thank you. Tasneem?
Yes, thanks, Matt. So on the question of migrant arrivals to the border with Algeria, so let me first say that over the past decade, many sub-Saharan migrants, and especially West Africans, come to Tunisia through without needing a visa, since Tunisia removed the visa requirement for several countries, which was basically driven by a desire and willingness, political willingness to strengthen cooperation with sub-Saharan countries, as Hamza explained earlier. However, since 2022, we have seen a year-on-year increase in the number of migrants who are coming through the border with Algeria. This appears to have started with the COVID-19 crisis, when migrants started arriving to Tunisia through the border with Algeria in search of better socioeconomic opportunities in Tunisia, and also to avoid the risk of deportation from Algeria, since the government there has also like a hardline approach on migration, and also migrants were fleeing xenophobic attitudes towards migrants. So at least between 2020 and 2022, Tunisia was seen as a safer option, I mean, in a region where xenophobic attitudes are on the rise. Obviously, this perception now most likely change it, since given what you have seen since the beginning of the year. Now, what brought the issue of migrant arrivals through the border with Algeria into the public debate is that this movement is no longer happening under the radar, is no longer a secret. Everybody is talking about this openly. Tunisian citizens in places like Sidi Bouzid, they are reporting that they are seeing migrants walking on foot from the western parts of Tunisia to Mahdia and Sfax, the key embarkation areas. So also people in these coastal areas, they see migrants arriving from Western governorates. There has been a proliferating smuggling business also. I mean, both smuggling networks active all along the Tunisian border with Algeria, facilitating the movement of these people, but also a proliferation of inland smuggling with people operating with cars, for instance, to transport migrants from places like Kasserine and Gafsa to Sfax. And also these migrant arrivals, they were concentrated all in Sfax, so in specific cities, which means that their visibility was really strong in those areas. And the tensions that we have seen this year are not new. Of course, what has happened during 2023 is unprecedented in terms of strong spike in violence and targeting of migrants. But back in 2021, we saw clashes between migrants and between local inhabitants in neighborhoods in Sfax that host substantial numbers of migrants. So those tensions have begun years back, and they have been mounting. But as Hamza said, in terms of policy planning in Tunisia, the government didn't address this issue and let it pile up. And as a result, we have arrived to this situation now where migrants are basically being scapegoated, are basically seen as one of the reasons for, or at least as accentuating the economic crisis in Tunisia, and as responsible for shortage of basic commodities that Tunisians have been struggling with. So following up on what Hamza was saying, I think the role of Algeria is being heavily discussed in Tunisia because people fear that the Tunisian government won't be able to stop the inflow of migrants through the border with Algeria, and that the Tunisian society and that Tunisians will have to bear the burden of the policy of the Algerian state. I mean, in terms of the impact of all this on movement through the border with Algeria, I mean, we have seen now the government has deported migrants to deserted areas. We have seen other governments in North Africa resort to this approach. We have seen this happen in Morocco, but also we have seen that this was only a stopgap measure. It was a temporary measure that can alleviate tensions temporarily, but migrants stuck in the border always go back to coastal areas to try to undertake the crossing to Europe, and that comes also at a cost, because from a humanitarian perspective, from a human rights perspective, migrants are left in very risky situations, stranded at the border, and their deprivation, I mean, becomes really acute, as we have seen in Morocco and other parts of North Africa. I mean, now in the medium term, the heightened focus on movement across the border and on the situation in Tunisia can cause a temporary stop in movement into Tunisia. We need also to take into consideration that the information travels very quickly in migrant groups. There are, for instance, some sub-Saharan migrant groups that are already warning migrants on the route to Tunisia of what's happening in the country. So some migrants may delay they delay their arrival, their journeys to Tunisia. But as we know, usually these measures only delay or disrupt routes to a certain extent, but other routes emerge, flows resume at one moment or another. But definitely now this is a key question for Tunisia. And as Hamza said, another key component there is to what extent the Tunisian security forces will be able to deal with the pressure, and especially now we are in summer season. It's the peak season for migration. There is a lot of pressure, migratory pressure in coastal areas. Added to that, the pressure on the land borders, it's unlikely that the Tunisian government will be able to dedicate resources to fully monitor Tunisia's borders, both on the maritime side and on the countries with Algeria and Libya.
Thank you, Tasneem. And certainly what you're pointing out also flags with findings from another recently released Global Initiative report that looks at irregular migration in Niger. And the finding from that report is really that the locus of migration through Niger has shifted to the west. So it's no longer towards Libya, but predominantly focused towards Algeria. And while not all those migrants are heading further north than Tamanrasset, and not all the migrants that head further north from Tamanrasset are destined for Tunisia. Certainly, it's a situation to watch because it does point at a broader systemic shift in migration routing throughout the Central Sahara. Anna, I'll turn it to you for the questions I posed, please.
Thank you, Matt. If I understood your question correctly, it's what or how the EU can influence how migrants are being treated and the protection issue. Is that broadly correct?
Yeah, I mean, so I think my question here, and I apologize if it was perhaps a little bit baroquely worded, is the European Union and member states right now are highly focused on stabilization and also on counter-migration. In your view, has there been strategic thinking that has been put to the ramifications of heightened migration enforcement? Essentially, strategic thinking that, to adopt Hamza's points, has forecast the emergence of situations such as what happened in Sfax, rising tension between citizens and migrants living in the city, and the responses of the Tunisian government and programs put in place to essentially to ensure protections are provided to the best degree possible.
Yes, thanks for that question. And I think it comes back to, well, 2 points. One, as I said before, the EU is not necessarily always coherent in its approach. So in that respect, it does have programs and more people-centered approaches. And I think it continuously is thinking about how to best ensure that what the EU does in its program financially in Tunisia helps peace and stability, and does sort of focus on justice issues. But I think as an outsider, it's also, you know, sometimes very difficult to influence. And we've heard the broader political economy and the complexity of it. But yes, I think there is some thinking sort of on the side of programs that the EU delegations, for example, run, how to deal with that political economy. I think sort of it's geared more towards how to focus on people-centered approaches vis-a-vis working with informal institutional actors, how to, in a space that is maybe declining on the issue of justice, how to still use that space, as well as how to promote governance principles. And I said that initially, you know, participation, transparency, accountability. How can the EU, one, as an external actors, and two, maybe if the approaches of the government is shifting, as how to act is part of the discussion. Maybe also reinforced support of civil society in the very broad sense, including research, universities, and what role that plays and whether the EU can support, while still avoiding a risk of being instrumentalized. I think maybe a question I also have to Tasneem and Hamza, following more closely, the EU seems to not be super well regarded and sometimes also used by the government as one of the actors that are trying to push unfavorable reforms. Maybe rightly so, also on migration, but so it's also a question what the EU as an actor in the population, you know, how is it regarded, and that links very strongly to the influence or the role it can play. But so yeah, I think there is, but sometimes not very coherent with other policies that the EU also pushes. So again, a question of what takes a stronger interest. And I would say currently, politically, the migration and sort of the security and stability agenda takes precedence over what I just said, the approaches that are still being discussed underneath.
So Hamza, Tasneem, do you have any responses to Anna's question? How is the EU and its approaches towards migration and support, how are these being seen and interpreted within Tunisia amongst the various constituencies? Tasneem, perhaps we could go first and then turn to Hamza.
Yes, sure. Actually, the latest string of visits by EU and European officials have stirred a very vivid debate in Tunisia. I mean, I could say that in general, the reactions were not positive to what the EU had proposed. I mean, it's largely seen as an offer to the Tunisian government to curb migration in return for very little money. That is unlikely to help Tunisia's economy, and that could actually run counter or be not consistent with the stated ambition of trying to help Tunisia and revive its economy. I think that's not to say that Tunisians regard negatively the EU. I don't know if there was a poll. I think I would say that most Tunisians are definitely in favor of a stronger cooperation with the EU, enhanced cooperation. But when it comes to migration, there is one controversial point, which is the proposals we have seen over the last few years for Tunisia to host sort of regional disembarkation platforms or migration centers where migrants disembarked at sea by Tunisian and Italian nationals can be placed, or now there are concerns that the European Union, that Italy may be seeking to deport sub-Saharan nationals to Tunisia. I mean, the repatriations of Tunisian nationals is already happening, and Tunisia has very advanced cooperation with Italy in that sense. But the readmission of third country nationals is definitely something that Tunisians, both the government and the population, reject. We have seen that the Tunisian government repeatedly rejected the clauses on the readmission of third country nationals, even in the context of discussions with the EU on the mobility partnership and the parallel readmission visa facilitation agreements. That continues to be the case. There are very little incentives on the Tunisian side to engage in such form of cooperation. Another thing which is affecting the perception of the EU at this stage is what's perceived as an increase in rejections of visa applications from some member countries like France. And it's especially, I mean, that this is being done in retaliation or as a way to encourage Tunisia to cooperate more efficiently on readmission. So yeah, I would say, I think at this point in time, I think the perception of the EU and this proposal isn't really very positive in Tunisia, and I've seen many negative reactions from CSOs. Over to you, Hamza.
Thank you, Tasneem. Actually, really, you covered it all. I would add maybe that it's clear that Europe is going through, the EU is going, I mean, through a sort of transactional, really, way to operate or to deal with Tunisia, like with other, I think, partners in the southern neighborhood. But the problem is that really this transaction seems to be really, I mean, as Tasneem mentioned, I mean, not matching or not really matching the expectation of the neither of the government nor the population, who were, I mean, the government was expecting much more, especially delinking the macro-financial assistance with the IMF deal. I think this is one of the key points that were on the table. Actually, the bulk of the stabilization package or the package deal is based on 800 or 900 million euros as a macro-financial assistance, but this is really under the condition of agreeing with the IMF, which is rejected by the president. So, and of course, I will echo Tasneem actually point, which is that the transforming Tunisia into a disembarkation platform, into a safe third country. I mean, what some EU member state called, or the EU framework, the new refugee and migration framework calls as a safe third countries, rejected, I think, by the population. especially that, I mean, the admission of Tunisians is quite advanced with Italy, with France, etc. So yeah, I mean, we are in a moment where the situation between the EU, or the relations between the EU and Tunisia are really, I mean, it's at a low level of trust, low level of cooperation in a way, but high concerns and high concerns about the future, about the potential, actually, not only, I mean, destabilization aspects or risks or threats coming from migration, but also from the political and economic situation in the country, this fragility of Tunisia, and I mean, and its consequences. So we moved, unfortunately, from a sort of value-based diplomacy where democracy was really supported and was one of the cornerstones of this cooperation between the EU and Tunisia, to more like a transactional cooperation. But unfortunately, I mean, this transactional cooperation is really not operating in a way. There is really no agreement on how to operate it, simply because both sides, they don't agree on the my sense is they don't share the same expectations, and at the same time there is a big question mark on to what extent actually today Tunisia is in need for really bigger, actually, and more engaged strategic, actually, a partnership with the EU, not really momentarily and maybe transactional deal related to a specific moment, which is, of course, I mean, driven by the migration crisis, because simply the country is really in need for a sort of long-term horizon. Unfortunately, this was not the case, or both sides were not able to achieve this over the previous 10 years, and they are still actually unable to really find way to really strategic and strong, actually, cooperation in the future.
So ending on a very realistic note, though not necessarily a positive note. Now we've got about 3 minutes left. I'd like to do a quick lightning round amongst the three of you. We've got a number of journalists that have tuned in to look at this, a number of researchers. I think one of the most interesting questions, drawing off the question and answer, is what's being missed right now? What are the stories that should be focused upon and the issues that should be focused upon, yet aren't getting the attention that they deserve? What should we be looking to, either in nuance or in substance, that's vitally important to the situation going forward? I'll start with Anna first, and then go to Tasneem and with Hamza.
What is being missed? I mean, a lot is also written about the EU-Tunisia deal, but I do think we need a constant reminder also in the media and by scholars and by CSOs on the value agenda that I mentioned. And that links to the longer term strategic partnership. What are the elements? And I think we've learned a lot in the last years on what that entails, and also including on the migration issue. And I think we also know what it not entails. The sad point, though, is that in the EU, the perception is that these transactional deals work to some extent on the issue of maybe short-term reduction of migrant flows. And we need to focus on what the risks for the long term. And we also have evidence from the past what that can entail. And I think that what needs to be highlighted much more. What are we losing?
Thank you very much. Tasneem, very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, I think whenever basically these issues of, North African countries playing a stronger role in border management and migration management, I think sometimes I feel there is this perception that North African countries are willing to do anything in exchange for money. And that perception, I think, is not true. I think there are more dynamics in them, different factors that influence the position of North African governments. They have their own interests and their own narratives and perceptions of the issue that need to be taken into consideration. So money is not really the answer.
Hamza?
Well, I totally agree with Anna and Tasneem, actually. I think that really, I mean, the southern neighborhood and North Africa specifically is a region, and I mean, in trouble in the sense that many countries, you look, I mean, you take Tunisia, Egypt, or Lebanon, are going through extremely economic social crisis. This is one fact. The second fact is that climate change is really a big phenomena. We are really witnessing and living through and experiencing actually the economics, the social and the human cost actually of the climate change. So my sense is that the surge in migration, maybe it's for the migration issues, it's the beginning, but not really the end. We are maybe at the beginning of a wave of migration simply because it's driven by a deterioration of the economic and social situation, but highly and the structural climate change, really. And if you look really to the Sahel, North Africa region, this is a region like really paying a high cost and high price of climate change. I mean, rural areas, we used to talk a lot about urban areas, about cities in Tunisia, but we are overlooking and underestimating the impact actually of climate change on rural areas. I mean, people are suffering, but in silence in a way, which is really sad and which is really dramatic in a way. So my sense is that really what Tunisia, but probably other countries, and what the EU should pay attention to is really the need to strategic engagement with the southern neighborhood. I think the old framework are no more operational in a way. They cannot. They failed to address the common challenges, and there is a need really to think for a new and innovative framework, because simply, I mean, the challenges are actually shared between both shores of the Mediterranean, and there is really a need for strategic thinking and strategic engagement of the EU vis-a-vis its southern neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very well put to end on a good strategic thought. So thank you very much, Hamza, Tasneem, Anna. I think this has been a really deep and rich and wide-ranging conversation. I'd encourage all of our watchers to look to the reports that have been created by Tasneem and by Hamza, to look to the broader work that's been done by the Carnegie Center, as well as the Global Initiative, as well as Anna's organization, whose acronym I can never actually get down, so I won't even attempt, but it does amazing work, and I heavily recommend reading it. And please do tune in further for future launch events that look around the issue of human smuggling and human trafficking in North Africa and the Sahel, coming out from the Global Initiative and likely out from Carnegie as well. So with that, I'll close this session, and thank you very much, and apologize to everybody that posed really good questions that I wasn't able to get to, your questions. But thank you again for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.